labelled the Scottish National Party as no different from any other nationalist movement that exists around the world, in that it needs a villain to fight against.
Scottish nationalists like to claim theirs is a different kind of nationalism, somehow uniquely benign. I'm sorry, but I'm not sure I can spot the difference. Like nationalist movements the world over, it requires an enemy to make it thrive. It needs another to rail against. It's all about finding something at which to take offence. So they pick fights about flags on packaging, scour news bulletins for examples of imaginary bias.
His comments come after First Minister Nicola Sturgeon distanced her party from anti-English nationalists, saying they won't be tolerated in the SNP. According to the latest polling data, 46% of Scots would now vote yes and a second vote on Scottish independence, while only 43% would vote no. SNP Member of Parliament Angus MacNeil told me that the movement for an independent Scotland cannot be tarred with the same brush as others.
Well, we're an independence movement, and
But the thing is, you're not though, are you? You're far from it at this point. You're most certainly not an independence movement. Had the 2016 referendum been different, then you wouldn't have been saying this. Nor would the SNP in general, for that matter. You're all trying so desperately hard to perpetuate this narrative that this is all about Scotland, it's all about our rights and our choices, etc, etc. Trying to blow smoke up our arses while telling those that you'll need to rely on if Brexit does happen. Tell them all the BS under the sun, all the BS that they want to hear. This isn't about independence. This isn't about Scotland nor its people, who apparently are expendable, as any fuck can be Scottish these days apparently. The truth of the matter is, Sturgeon wants to remain in the EU, so all else pales in significance to that fact. And her rather questionable blind loyalty is why we're hearing this shite about independence. It's the only reason we're hearing about independence. Because if Brexit does happen, then they are going to have to try their damnedest to rely on a second independence referendum. Even though, as things currently stand, and as 2017's election showed them, they won't win.
You find that those sort of nationalist movements are actually movements that are already within countries that are independent. I mean, Donald Trump's carry on in the States, what's happening in Brazil, those are the sort of movements of countries that are the way to be chauvinist or maybe even imperialist. I think the worst that the UK was the height of the British Empire, a catastrophe that was rained down on many peoples across planet Earth. In fact, we are as a movement towards independence. We want to cooperate with our neighbours and do what other countries do, be like Ireland, be like Finland, be like Denmark, and be decent around the world, and not at all be like the Tory party.
Being decent around the world and being like other countries. But that doesn't require us to beg the EU to let us back into their club. So your points really ain't worth a damn, as you're only making them as part of a case for rejoining Europe, and not a case for independence. Common misconception that you people seem to be getting away with a bit too often these days.
And the point of telling you that is that many English people, when they move to Scotland, like many other nationalities, join the SNP because they start to understand very quickly that the best way for a better life in Scotland is to make,
as well as the fact there's no viable options in terms of an alternative,
decisions close to home in Scotland. It doesn't matter.
UK has already left the European Union. How do you map out Scotland's path back into the bloc?
Well, some of the detail of that, of course, depends on what the final outcome for the UK is, and in the absence of knowing that, some of this discussion becomes quite speculative and hypothetical. But whatever that path turns out to be, and I'm not trying to suggest that there will be no tough discussions to have there, and Scotland will require, like all member states do, to demonstrate that it's willing not just to take the benefits of EU membership, but live up to the responsibilities as well.
Now, even if there's a choice for individual countries to make in regards to whether or not they decide to undertake their tasks or their responsibilities and so on, we all know that the SNP will be happy to oblige in that regard.
Making them, as long as they're living in Scotland, their ethnicity doesn't matter.
Their ethnicity doesn't matter. I hear relentlessly from the SNP that anybody and everybody is welcome here, and each is just as Scottish as the next. There does lie beneath it all a rather nefarious element to that level of pondering, if I'm quite honest. Where do native Scots, or dare I say, Indigenous Scots fit into that concept? When the SNP continuously refer to themselves as the most pro-immigration party in the UK, and that's of course disregarding the fact that not everybody's on board with that at all. My nationalism is rooted in a desire to make the country I live in as good as it can be. I live in. Notice the word use. It's not even the country she's from. This isn't about nationalism, as she says herself. It's internationalism. The idea of eroding borders and becoming one big happy family on the world stage. Global citizens, you've heard it all before. When you talk about a diverse population or an increase in diversity in the population, there's the diversity in said population, and then there is the ethnic Scottish people. But they seem to be getting swept under the rug, as this references in regards to anybody can be Scottish is becoming more and more and more ingrained into the narrative every single fucking day, and nobody seems to be noticing the issue in regards to that. All of a sudden the far right is supposedly on the rise everywhere across the world, and simultaneously all of a sudden nationalism is attributed to said far right, with the UN about a month or two ago calling for global action to crack down on the anti-immigration rhetoric because it was supposedly akin to Nazi Germany before Nazi Germany, if you catch my drift. Obviously trying to imply that people that have an issue with immigration, etc., or nationalists even in general, were identical, if not very similar to that of the Nazis. Nicola Sturgeon come out on several occasions. Now we've had Hamza Yusuf, some other dude from the SNP, both coming out and disavowing the term nationalist because of its connotations that were never an issue 4 or 5 years ago, but now all of a sudden they are. And then that paved the way for the education in Scotland, if you all remember, that I made a video on not too long ago. The far left education that they're imposing in the schools, where they teach them all they need to know about genocides and fascism, with their one-sided version of events, but they never ever touch upon communism, never ever touch upon any of those things. Oh no. Because do Indigenous or native Scots fit in where this is concerned?
So in Birmingham, for instance, having a black Brummie is not unusual, and a Birmingham person would think that. In London the same, in Liverpool the same, but in Scotland, in any Scottish city, although we've got a large diverse population here.
But you're not Scottish. You might have been born and raised in Scotland, which of course on paper makes you Scottish, but you're a descendant from somewhere else. I am not. That's not an us versus them narrative. That's not racism. It's a fact, but it's a fact that seems to be getting glossed over here. But this constant push to imply that anybody and everybody can rock up here and claim to be just as Scottish as I am, just as Scottish as my mother, just as Scottish as my grandfather, just as Scottish as his father, and just as Scottish as his 3 brothers that lost their lives, and the 2 sisters that during World War II, just as Scottish as their parents, and so on and so forth, descendants, ancestors, etc. And somebody can just come along as a new Scot and be just as Scottish as I am. Really?
If you say Glaswegian, the image that comes to your head isn't necessarily of a black Glaswegian.
And what is the problem with that exactly? Why do we now need to change public perception? Where do native Scots fit into this? When we get told about our societies becoming increasingly diverse, where do we fit into this? Why are these questions not being fucking asked?